Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan have celebrated the 20th anniversaries of their independence. However, over these 20 years, for these countries, human rights have not become the main value. Today, all of them encounter serious problems with respect for fundamental human rights and freedoms. Independent human rights groups of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan cannot work freely, being constantly under pressure from the local government. Many of them are afraid to comment openly on the situation concerning human rights and freedoms in their countries.
Если оценивать вообще ситуацию с правами человека в Центральной Азии, то невозможно.
Talking about the situation with human rights in Central Asia, we firstly need to have an insight into the history of the region to see that Central Asia is a product of the Soviet Union. To be precise, the Central Asian region is a product of its breakdown. For over 20 years, the region has borne features that are common to the Soviet Union's approach to human rights and freedoms. As we know, in the Soviet Union, political rights and civil freedoms were strictly controlled by the government or ignored altogether. The very idea of the system that still exists in all the countries in Central Asia lies in the priority of the government's interests over individual rights and freedoms.
Является приоритет интересов государства над индивидуальными правами и свободами.
Zhangozyen, Western Kazakhstan. On 16th of December, the 20th anniversary of Kazakhstan's independence, 16 people were killed as a result of protests which were severely put down by the security forces, official statistics say. This was the end to an oil strike in Zhangozyen that had lasted for 7 months. For 3 days after the massacres started, journalists weren't allowed into the city, telephone communications were cut off, and several websites were blocked. The International Human Rights Organization Article 19 published the following in a statement called Kazakhstan, 2 decades of independence have not benefited free speech. The absence of information following several violent clashes on 16th of December between police and demonstrators in Zhangozyen exemplifies Kazakhstan's lack of progress in protecting and promoting the right to freedom of expression, the human rights defenders stated in the document. Before, the government paid great attention to its image, with the purpose of looking correct in front of its international partners, especially Western countries. But currently, image is not that important. Having been replaced by other motives, it's obvious that one person takes the lead in the realization of freedom of speech as well as everything else. He makes the decision concerning the consequences for him or for the country in general. If earlier the government was afraid of coverage of certain issues related to the president or to national security, currently there are quite a lot of topics that could bring trouble to journalists. The shutdown of several websites, including Twitter, in Zhangozyen after the massacres, were another attempt by the government to control the internet space. In 2011, access to 160 websites was blocked or limited. One of the greatest public concerns was the shutdown of the Stan video portal and the blocking of the LiveJournal blogging platform. According to our monitoring, over the last 10 years, the situation concerning human rights has had the same trend. Real conditions for realizing freedom of speech have become worse. As for the Stan video portal, this was an alarm signal that showed at which level a particular topic could be covered. If journalists go really far in covering a problem, repeatedly showing it, and the problem is not solved, then the authorities find different ways to control the mass media. Actually, Stan experienced all tools of government pressure. In 2010, Kazakhstan chaired the OSCE. However, the country still has not fulfilled the obligations it assumed in the field of human rights. At present, the country has almost no operating independent and free mass media outlets. Censorship and self-censorship are among the serious threats. Journalists are attacked and brought to book on criminal and administrative charges for criticizing the government.
Что может произойти со свободой слова в Казахстане? Понятно, что
What will happen to freedom of speech in Kazakhstan? I don't have many positive thoughts about that, considering the law on national security. This draft law includes such paragraphs as negative coverage of the processes that take place in the country. What do they mean by negative here? It could be the truth or it could be a lie. The truth can be different. So the authorities will have the opportunity to close any mass media outlet that shows life's truth and doesn't follow the law.
Возможность прикрывать любые СМИ.
И вот этот маятник, который...
So the development of the situation that has already reached its peak will go into reverse. Time cannot stop. We have not been able to prevent democratic changes, and they will surely happen in the field of freedom of speech. Another question is when they will.
Другой вопрос, когда они будут.
Turkmenistan. Here, the government has a total monopoly on the mass media. The main assignment allocated to outlets is to support the ideology of the ruling regime. All print media in the country are of a propaganda or ideological nature. Turkmenistan has no independent or opposition newspapers or magazines.
Как было заложено еще при Ниязове, свободных в Туркменистане нет, так эта ситуация остается.
From the time of Niyazov's rule, there have been no free mass media outlets in the country. Although the president has changed, private and independent media are still owned by the government. Legislation provides no regulations to register one's own media outlet. Instead, a censorship committee with a wide range of powers has been established under the Cabinet of Ministers of Turkmenistan. It checks everything that is published by the state-controlled media, although previously they were under pressure as well. Preliminary checks, limited access to information for the public and media, governmental ownership of all outlets, all these are reasons why the laws do not correspond with the real situation. Access to independent information from foreign sources is also limited due to strict control over the foreign media and internet use. By order of the president, the authorities even removed satellite TV antennas from the roofs of residential buildings, explaining that they are detrimental to the overall appearance. Recently, we were granted the opportunity to use the internet. However, it is limited. Almost all of the websites that criticize Turkmenistan are blocked. There is no access to YouTube. The public has no opportunity to use Twitter or Facebook. Because of the absolute control over the internet, Turkmen independent journalists and civil activists have no opportunity to maintain contacts with foreign media. Such attempts are strictly prohibited by the authorities. Journalists, for example those from Radio Liberty, who try to cooperate with the mass media, are persecuted. Another recent example is Davlet Murat Yeskuliev, who was sentenced to 5 years in prison in 2011. Only due to pressure from the international community was he released. Another 2 journalists were placed in a psychiatric clinic. No criminal charges were brought against them. These people were simply deemed mentally ill and placed into a clinic. Another example of violations of media freedom is the shutdown of the Chronicles of Turkmenistan website, supported by the Turkmen Initiative for Human Rights. The website was the only source publishing information about a tragedy that took place near Ashgabat when a lot of people died in an explosion at a military depot. The authorities tried to close off this information. The website was attacked by hackers. It stopped working, and many efforts were made to recover it. Nowadays, the Uzbek media provide information only about achievements that are not so important, while serious and problematic issues remain almost uncovered. There are only a few journalists and independent websites that dare to cover such topics. They are blocked by the government and can be accessed through proxy servers or anonymizers. The authorities of Uzbekistan try to block any information about the situation concerning human rights in the country. Print and online media outlets cannot openly criticize the activities of the government. That is why the topics covered in the country's media are the same, with the publication only of official statements. After the Andijan tragedy in 2005, almost all foreign journalists and media that provided alternative coverage of the situation in the country were banished.
Вот все проходили суды над
At trials, independent journalists from local and foreign media outlets have faced criminal charges for libel and slander. Nobody's guilt was proven. However, the courts were simply ordered to impose fines and punishments. The Constitution of Uzbekistan proclaims freedom of conscience, speech, and opinion. However, the government limits these rights in practice. Almost all information is strictly controlled. The country has no media outlets that can independently cover the political and economic situation.
Я не думаю, что в ближайшее время что-то
I don't think the situation will improve in the near future. In order to have positive changes, the dictatorial regime should change itself.
изменился сам режим.
Трудно вообще говорить о свободе религии.
It's hard to speak about freedom of conscience and religion when the very notion of them has been removed from legislation.
И законодательства.
Last autumn, Kazakhstan adopted a law on religion. Human rights defenders stated that the new law was undemocratic and did not correspond with international standards. In their opinion, the law poses serious problems to the realization of freedom of conscience, as well as to the creation and operation of religious associations.
Начиная где-то с 98 года, после России, когда там в 97
Since 1988, 1 year after Russia passed such a law, our country has made 7 attempts to adopt a draft law. For 13 years, the community resisted, and finally, the government got what it wanted.
государство добилось того, чего хотело.
Currently, a religious association cannot be registered unless it has 50 members. A restriction like this contradicts the Constitution, which stipulates that everyone has the right to freedom of conscience, either alone or in community with others. Moreover, the law prohibits rooms for the namaz or prayers in government establishments and stipulates the re-registration of religious organizations.
Если говорить более масштабно о прогнозах, я думаю, каких-то позитивных тенденций, которые могли бы говорить...
Speaking more generally about forecasts, I think there will be no positive changes in the situation. From our point of view, the authorities haven't taken any action to alter the declining dynamics in the field of religion.
Что смогло бы изменить вот эту ухудшающуюся динамику, которая касается вот сферы религии.
Будет большая чистка, и от нашей хваленой казахстанской многоконфессиональной...
There will be a big purge, and almost nothing will be left of the multi-confessionalism and tolerance we are proud of.
Практически ничего не остается.
В последнее время очень увеличивается количество погибших.
Recently, the number of people tortured to death in prisons has started to grow. The majority of them were brought to book under religious charges. They were cruelly tortured.
По религиозным мотивам. Больше всех пытки.
Relatives said that when the dead body of the prisoner was shown to them,
Жестокие пытки. Со слов близких
there were
родственников.
bruises and cuts that didn't correspond with the cause of death given by the prison doctor. The latter usually indicate heart failure. As a rule, in such cases, the bodies are brought at night and their families are forced to bury them by the morning to avoid crowds of relatives at the ceremony.
Не соответствует.
The Uzbek authorities have always tried to prove that they have no problems with freedom of religion in the country and that the constitution and legislation of Uzbekistan follow the basic norms of corresponding international regulations. At the same time, according to Uzbek human rights defenders dealing with religious cases, thousands of people are in prison for such cases.
Сейчас в Узбекистане
In Uzbekistan, there are about 11,000 people who were found guilty on religious charges, although the court failed to prove their guilt in all cases.
содержатся в тюрьмах.
There is no separate law on peaceful assembly. This field is regulated by administrative and criminal laws. And even if a person wants to apply for permission to hold an assembly, there is no special judicial procedure for that. In rare cases, people take risks. There was a case on the 8th of June 2011 when people living on one street in the capital protested against the demolition of their houses. The authorities wanted to build some white marble hotels there, moving people to communal apartments or to their relatives' houses. The people were obviously against that. Nearly 50 people protested, but the police dispersed the assembly. 4 women were arrested as the main troublemakers. Their fate is unknown.
Посчитали зачинщиками митинга. Дальнейшая их судьба нам неизвестна.
Meanwhile, when the government organises any assembly or holiday, it forcibly gathers students and staff from governmental establishments. The participants rehearse, march, and learn the necessary cheering. People are even supposed to celebrate New Year, which is traditionally considered a family holiday, on city squares, where they are supposed to stay until the president of Turkmenistan gives his celebratory speech at midnight. Only after that can they go home.
Действующий закон о свободе собраний как минимум препятственно и очень препятственно позволяет иногда гражданам
The current law on freedom of assembly actually restricts the civil right in question. Simply speaking, the constitutional norm on freedom of assembly is violated by the law, which should be based on the right provided by the constitution. If you really want to hold an assembly in Kazakhstan nowadays, you will fail, because officials will find a reason to ban your
Потому
attempt.
что чиновник может придумать все, что угодно, и как угодно запретить это собрание.
The reason is the absence of political will or desire to provide this freedom. And if there are no such intentions, the authorities will always try to find different ways and methods to avoid the realization of rights such as these. Analysis of legislation and research of current law enforcement practice carried out by Kazakh human rights defenders have shown that Kazakhstan ignores international standards in the field of freedom of peaceful assembly. The authorities prohibit such assemblies for political reasons. The government also widely practices bans on holding peaceful assemblies in public places, allowing them only far away from city centres. Moreover, the police can unreasonably punish or apply force against such unsanctioned assemblies. As a rule, the opposition and organisations that criticise the current government are refused permission to conduct such meetings.
Но если рассматривать политическим, социальным...
Considering political and social events, for example, the National Human Rights Action Plan for 2009 to 2012 has defined an improvement in the situation as a future trend. Supposedly, the granting of permission is to be replaced by notification. This means that if I want to hold an assembly with somebody, we can notify the government and hold whatever we want. But I think that the fight against terrorism, even if it is a so-called fight, will make those norms stipulated by the national plan and those positive impulses useless.
будут сведены на нет.
Если человеку есть что возразить, протестовать, то есть если у него...
If a person has something to say, if he wants to protest and there is something he is against, no law will help. The authorities can either support and guide such actions in a constructive way or prohibit them, which only makes everything worse.
Препятствовать и получить еще худшие результаты.
Если делать такой общий прогноз,
As for the general forecast, the situation is not that promising. There are no grounds even for moderate optimism.
какого-то даже умеренного оптимизма нет. Если
If there are no political reforms, if the system is not changed at least through evolution, not saying revolution, on the path towards better examples of a democratic social and political structure, we will have no hope for positive changes in the situation with human rights and freedoms.
то рассчитывать на какие-то изменения позитивные в области прав и свобод человека вообще не приходится.